Hi, I'm Lynn Paul. I'm happy to join you again today. We're going to talk about therapeutics and treatments for agenesis of the corpus callosum, disorders of the corpus callosum. Now, to start out, I want to talk about this term treatments. Treatments typically suggest that it's perhaps medical, some kind of formal, specific treatment. Families often ask, are there treatment plans? Are there approved approaches to treating ACC or DCC, agenesis or dysgenesis? There is no standardized treatment approach. There's no medical treatment that is specific to all people with agenesis or dysgenesis. There's not any, I'm not aware of any controlled medical trials for this condition. But there are things that we've learned through the years about this condition that inform how you intervene. So shifting from the idea of treatment, I'm going to focus today on interventions. So how to intervene and why to intervene. My stance, from having studied the cognitive and psychosocial symptoms that are common among people with ACC, that are most likely due to having the absence of the corpus callosum or limits to the corpus callosum, not due to the other condition or aspects of what's ever going on for your child. My perspective is focus on what they're doing and let the brain figure out how. What does that mean? Well, some parents will ask, should I be doing special exercises to help with midline transfer or to help build up the connections between the hemispheres? That's presuming that we know how the brain is compensating for having the absence of the corpus callosum. And we have some hypotheses at this point and some studies that when a few people suggest maybe there are these different mechanisms for how the brain compensates. But the reality is, at this point, we don't really know. What I do know, and we know from a lot of neuroscience, is that the brain makes connections and reinforces the connections that are there as it learns new things. And that it will do all that it can, make whatever connections it can make to try to achieve what the person is trying to achieve. Let me put this a different way. When we think about intervening, one type of intervention is developmental. It's a way we can support the current developmental challenges. You know that your child has a brain malformation. If you found out very young, and you know that they may progress very typically, but they may have some struggles. So one way to intervene is to say, oh, they're lagging just ever so slightly on this milestone or this skill. I'm going to help them. I'm going to give them extra support. It's kind of just enriching their learning experience, really emphasizing and supporting and helping them master something. So it's not treatment, it's just extra support. Another type of intervention is focused on a disability. So it might be focused on some kind of targeted support provided to this specific difficulty. So a child who has mobility problems may need a lot more focused work on mobility. And what that means at different times across their lifespan may change. It may be helping them crawl, it may be helping them walk. It's not just meeting the typical developmental milestone, but it's really supporting them in that challenge. Some people with DCC have speech difficulties. And so that may be an ongoing disability or difficulty that they have throughout their life. And so or at least for many years. And so there's targeted work on that particular challenge. Now, I'm going to expand this a little bit because of my concerns and experience with the DCC community. I think it's important to think in terms of systemic intervention. Those are the interventions that you as a parent take to help establish and maintain life skills and help minimize the impact of the corpus callosum malformation across this individual's life. And that's not just focused on a specific skill, it's focused on how do we set up their life? How do we set up the home? How do we set up routines? We'll come back to that in a minute. And then the last intervention approach that I think of, or a way of thinking about interventions, is that it's progressive, that intervention is not a static thing. How we intervene, how we support and help someone with ACC changes over time. And ultimately, our goal is to help them become independent. Now, I don't mean not dependent on anyone, but I mean self-directed, somewhat autonomous, in control of their own life and in control of choosing who helps them when possible. That's what I mean by independence. So it may be that as a parent, you're much more involved in working directly with the therapists or the teachers or whoever is in their life as they're younger, but you work to help them become the person who talks to the teacher. And so your role shifts from intervening directly with the teacher to intervening with your person with DCC to empower them to talk to the teacher. So that's what I mean by a progressive approach to intervention. Where you intervene changes based on the person's abilities, circumstances, and development. So let's briefly go through the different types of therapy that are most common. And these are the standard, truly therapies, not talking about medical interventions, but common therapies for rehabilitation or for developmental disabilities of some sort, or occupational therapy. So helping someone learn how to do daily activities. A lot of times these are manual things, but it may be things as practical as learning to iron or how to get in and out of the shower, because figuring out how to manage the shower is the issue. The other type of therapy that kind of gets mixed up with this sometimes is physical therapy. Physical therapy is focused on the body movements. So transferring from one place to the other, balance, walking, just control of your body. Another common therapy is speech and language therapy. And I want you to think of that in terms of communication. It's not just speech, but it's hearing and understanding, and or maybe it's sign language. It's figuring out how to communicate with other people. And that can also start to go into more of the social arena as a child gets older. There's also behavioral therapy. This can start really young and continue on through life. The focus of behavioral therapy is reinforcing adaptive behaviors, functional behaviors, managing anger, figuring out how to behave in ways that get you what you want, that don't cause undue distress to everybody around you and get you in trouble. There's applied behavior analysis. There's, for younger kids, there's behavior therapy. For adults, there's a broad range of this, but it's very concrete, focused on reinforcing behaviors, not as much on thinking or insight. And then the last one I want to mention are social skills training programs. And again, it can go across the lifespan and focused on helping someone figure out not just how to communicate, but how to handle nuances of social interaction. All of these types of therapy are offered typically for a child, infant and on, who has a developmental disability. And, or hopefully they're offered. And I would encourage you to use those. Again, even if your child is progressing well, these can be helpful for supporting development, for helping a child as they move through basic common developmental milestones. These can also be helpful for targeting specific disabilities and helping a child master something or learn to cope with a disability that they're going to have for a longer period of time. So these are tools that you should be able to find professionals, hopefully, that can work with you on. Now, my other comments about intervening are, you have a child with a known brain abnormality. We know that early intervention has the greatest potential to impact brain development. So don't wait. You want to support the natural progress of development. You want to be active and help them learn and grow and give a very enriched environment. Don't wait and see if there are problems. Be right on the edge of knowing the child's learning to crawl. What are things we can do to help them learn to crawl? The child's learning to speak. How's that going? Can we read a lot to them? What are the things we do to just generally support and encourage development? It's amazing how most children go through the same phases of development, whether anybody's paying attention or not. But a child with a brain abnormality may need a little extra support to really move through those steps as to the best that they can. They may still get there if you don't pay attention, but why not give them all the support you can early on? The other thing about this early intervention and throughout their life is when there's a new skill that they have to learn, reading, maybe it's walking, maybe it's feeding themselves. Focus on one skill that that's appropriate and is where what they're trying to learn, and give them a lot of support for that and really master it as much as possible. We have a tendency to want to throw a lot of different things at a child. Caught myself reading to my great niece the other day and saying, this is a fish and this is red, and this is one. And I thought, how in the world is her little brain making sense of the fact that I'm pointing to the same object and saying different words? It's amazing how the brain can learn those things. But if you discover that your child's not getting some of these concepts, then stop and break it down and simplify their learning for them. Focus on colors for a few weeks or months. Focus on numbers. Focus on words, and try to simplify so that you're not throwing a bunch of concepts at the same time at the child. That's an intervention. It's just a strategy for helping your child learn. The goal is to help the brain and the body find ways to do what needs to be done. You're not trying to make connections. You're letting the brain do what it does. That's what learning is the brain reinforcing connections between neurons and setting up systems to do whatever skill needs to be done. My next comment on intervention goes more toward the systemic discussion. Over the last 25 years, we've learned a lot about the areas of functioning that are challenged by having a disorder of the corpus callosum. And if you were listening to Dr. Brown earlier, I'm sure you heard him talk about there's the transfer of information between the hemispheres is reduced, that people with complete agenesis or agenesis partial even typically have slower processing speed. Their brain is having to work harder to keep up. It's not that it can't process information, it's just a little bit more time consuming, a little more challenging for each step in the process. And complexity, like I was just getting at, if you have multiple concepts coming at you at the same time, like numbers and letters, and that can be overwhelming often for people with ACC. So knowing that, knowing those basic cognitive challenges, you can start thinking as a parent, as a teacher, how can I support this child's development by setting up routines and reinforcing automation. By having routines and automating things, then our brain can focus on, our thoughts can focus on the things that are harder. Remember when you learned to drive? If you do, it took a lot of concentration. You're thinking about where your feet are, you're thinking about where your hands are, you're thinking about what you're looking at and all these rules. And now, as an adult, I can tell you, I can drive through Los Angeles and think, how did I get here? I have automated so many of these processes. They don't take a lot of attention and focused problem solving. Now, my brain's doing all those problem solving, but it's automated. That's a great example of how you want to help systematize and free up resources for your child. The other component of that is routines. If I always put my keys down in the same place when I walk in the front door, then I don't waste time looking for my keys when it's time to go somewhere. Simple example. But if you have limited resources, if your brain gets tired easily, then you want to not waste your resources on looking for keys, right? So tackling one skill at a time until it's automated, like I said before, practice, practice, practice. The better someone gets at reading, the less they're focused on the reading and the more they can focus on what they are actually reading, the content. As long as a child is having difficulty reading, they're not going to learn from reading. They're just going to be learning to read. See the difference? So practice and make so that things are automated, and then come up with systems, routines that a child can use to simplify things, to minimize their extra cognitive effort. And here's the challenge for parents, is coming up with systems that can grow with the child. So you might start using systems early in life and consistently use them over the years, adapting as the child grows. For example, a child may not need a calendar to keep track of their assignments until junior high or middle school or high school or secondary, whatever you call it in your country. But if the child has grown up knowing that they carry this little book, and this book is where the teacher puts the assignments, and then that's where they write their assignments, and then carrying that little book, that calendar, that planner is something that you've introduced when they're young, and it's just part of life and they don't fight you about it. And it becomes a tool that they use. You don't have to try to convince them to use it when they need it most, and when they're in adolescence and might not be as willing to try something new. So that's just one example. Thinking in terms of how can we set up systems that will work well for the child and that are consistent, that you don't change. Carry that backpack and you have one folder for the papers that go to school and one folder for the papers that come home. And you start it in kindergarten and you reinforce it over and 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 try to get it automated. And maybe in time you change which color those folders are. Make it a little more flexible. You don't want the child to be totally rigid, but you want them to have systems. So those are the kind of things that you can start really young. Things that sometimes we don't even do until we're older and our brains start to slip a little and we're using lists more because we can't remember as much. Well, why not use them when you're young and free up cognitive resources? That's an intervention. So I hope I've helped you shift some of your thinking. And I'll come back to this one more time. But when we're thinking about intervening and helping your child, you want to support development. If they have some kind of specific disability, then get all the help that they need to learn to overcome and compensate and cope with that challenge, right? You want to help them have systems in place that support their thinking and support their life. And lastly, you always want to keep in mind the long-term goal, the ultimate goal. And that may shift over time. This is the progressive component of intervening. I think probably most parents want their child to be healthy. They want them to be well as much as possible. They want them to be safe. Ultimately, you want them to be self-directed, like I was saying, independent, or at least as in control of their own life and their own destiny as possible. You want them to have responsibility for themselves, not be at the beck and call and the whim of other people. Have relationships. Those are just some of the things that came to my mind. I encourage you to think about those and keep them tucked away. These are the goals for my child. And often with kids with DCC, as they grow up, you start to discover what their potential is. It may be that they are really going to be very high functioning with some select challenges. Maybe you'll discover that your child won't speak, or your child's going to have mobility issues. Maybe they're not as cognitively able as you would hope. And those things need to inform your goals for their life. And there may be points where you decide our intervention is not on trying to get this child to speak. My goal is, and the interventions need to focus on helping him or her communicate and connect and have social relationships and be independent, because tackling that one disability is getting in the way of actually building up skills that are going to help him or her meet the ultimate goals. Those are all some of the things that come to my mind. I encourage you to talk to other parents, and I encourage you to support researchers and the IRC5 and other groups that are trying to move toward figuring out if we can have some more standardized treatment approaches. In the meantime, you're the primary intervention specialist for your child. And ultimately, he or she will be the ultimate intervention specialist for himself.